So, Justin, in today's time, putting across the word peace is a heavy loaded word. So could you deconstruct what the Paris Peace Forum is, what the mandate was when you conceptualized the forum back in 2018, and where it stands today?
Thanks, Trisha. Welcome, everyone. Yes, the idea was at the beginning that we needed to address the global challenges and that the current institutions needed to be complemented by a multi-actor effort, joining prime ministers and presidents along with NGOs, along with the private sector, along with philanthropies, with public development banks and others. And year after year, we built this organization, which really now is three things. First, it's an annual event, which gathers all these different categories of actors in order to have impact on these very global issues that we are trying to address, to these global challenges. Second, the forum from the start was a booster of events, of solutions, of concrete solutions coming from civil society, coming from international organizations, coming from the private sector and many others. And third, more recently, the forum has really become a policy organization able to not only launch initiatives, but follow up on them all year round, to launch multi-actor coalitions, which for some subjects is really the only way that we can make a difference. And lastly, have some political momentum to address the gravest challenges of the day.
Yes. Speaking of, the forum will be held on the 11th and the 12th of November. We have a new venue that we will be hosting the forum at. It's the Palais Brongniart. So we look forward to that. As well as this year, the forum will be in person. So we welcome your presence and what you could bring to the forum. And finally, towards the subject. This year, the forum will be addressing preserving global cooperation in times of war. Over to you, Justin.
Yes, and that will also be the topic of this afternoon, of this spring meeting of the forum. Let me give you the outline of the program. In just a minute, we'll be transitioning to a discussion with UN Secretary General António Guterres that you, Trisha, conducted yesterday evening. So it's quite fresh. And in this interview, Secretary General Guterres makes a number of very important political points. At 4 p.m. Paris time, I will moderate a panel on how we can preserve global cooperation in times of war. How can we avoid the war in Ukraine making one more collateral damage, which would be global cooperation. Then at 5 p.m., Pascal Lamy, the president of the forum, will moderate a really important panel on food security. As you know, one of the consequences of the war has been this looming danger on food security. There are many ways to address that, and the Paris Peace Forum wants to do its part through this panel by gathering many organizations that are at the forefront of this fight. But right now, I suggest we transition directly to the interview of UN Secretary General António Guterres that you conducted yesterday. Enjoy this spring meeting.
We have had the pleasure and honor to welcome the Secretary General of the United Nations, António Guterres, for all the past editions of the Paris Peace Forum. Although I must admit, this year your presence is of extreme more importance than it's been in the past, I would say. Paris Peace Forum has worked since its inception to promote good global governance. What do we mean by that? By investing in resilience of multilateral institutions, of global cooperation, and critically platforming and promoting the projects, the on-ground work that is happening on a national, global, international level through the community of Paris Peace Forum. This year, as we prepare for the next edition of the forum, we will be focusing on preserving global cooperation in times of war, in the context of war that is happening in Ukraine. So we're looking forward to hearing your take, Secretary General, on this topic as the main stakeholder that everyone is looking to for some sort of direction and hope. So I know you don't like wasting a lot of time with pleasantries, so I will get right to it. You have repeatedly cited the sanctity of the UN Charter and international law to underscore why the UN recognizes what's happening in Ukraine as an invasion of sovereign territory. It was a specifically strong moment when you said the exact same words when you were facing President Putin as well, and not regarded it as a special military operation by Russia. How do we fortify trust in entities such as the UN, principle of common goods, during these times of war? And I'm asking you this knowing that currently there are people in Ukraine who would be listening to your words right now.
Well, first of all, we were clear in our position. This was a violation, as you mentioned, of international law, of the UN Charter. It was an invasion of a country by another, and the second, of course, being a permanent member of the Security Council, which made the Security Council totally unable to take any meaningful position because obviously permanent members, as you know, have the right to veto. So our position is clear. Now, what can we do in the Secretariat of the UN? It is obvious that at the present moment, there are no peace negotiations taking part, and the UN was never asked to have a direct action in relation to those peace negotiations. We were not part of the Minsk agreement, we were not part of the Normandy format. So we have been, of course, asking for the war to end, we have been asking for ceasefires, but where we believe we have a contribution to give is essentially on the humanitarian dimension, and is essentially on reducing the impacts of this war in relation to the global crisis that it is triggering, namely in relation to food, energy, and finance. So my first objective was to make the corridors for evacuation of civilians work, and simultaneously for aid to be distributed work. There was one dramatic situation that was blocked for months, and that situation was Azovstal. And my main objective when visiting Russia was to unblock that and to create conditions for the UN together with the ICRC, and of course cooperating with the Russian and the Ukrainian authorities to unblock that situation. And that was successfully done. It was complex, it was difficult, it had many obstacles, but it was done. And on the other hand, I've been doing everything I can and engaging directly with the parties. We created with our global response group task teams that are technically prepared in order to have a package deal. We would like to have a package deal allowing Ukrainian foodstuffs to be exported through the Black Sea, which means ending a situation in which Ukraine is not able to export its grain and other products, with dramatic consequences in the global markets, but also with dramatic consequences for the Ukraine, because the next harvest is coming and the silos are full. And at the same time, to unblock the ban of the Russian Federation for the exports of food and fertilizers that are absolutely needed in international markets, and to discuss with the US and the EU. There are no restrictions, there are no sanctions on food and fertilizers, but there are a number of questions that need to be solved in order for those exports of food and fertilizers to be able to overcome the problems of shipping, of insurance, of payments, etc. So we need a package deal to put those two productions, the production of food by the Ukraine, the production of food and fertilizers by Russia, available to international markets, to end this dramatic situation in which the increase of food prices and the increase of energy prices is putting many developing countries in the risk of collapse. This crisis comes on top of another group of crises. We had the COVID, and we had vaccines unfairly distribution, and we have resources for recovery unfairly distribution. Developed countries had trillions to reanimate their economies. Developing countries had much less resources, and many of them are on the verge of a debt default or have no fiscal space. So we need at the same time to make sure that we are able to do everything we can to have a positive influence in the food market, in the energy market, to end all kinds of restrictions and boycotts that exist by some countries in relation to their exports and other kinds of things. And at the same time, we need to address the dramatic debt and liquidity problems of developing countries. So all these are actions that the UN can do. First of all, we fight for peace, we fight for peace, for ceasefires, we fight for the end of the war. This invasion must end, troops must go back to the barracks, but at the same time, we are putting all our capacities in addressing the humanitarian consequences and putting all our capacities to try to help, especially developing countries, overcome the huge challenges they are facing, and at the same time responding to what it is a basic need for the Ukraine. And the basic need for the Ukraine is, of course, to be able to export their grains.
Thank you, Secretary General. You've been raising consistently the concern about the food security crisis due to the ongoing war that we're seeing as well. And as you rightfully mentioned, the African continent has suffered unfairly, even with vaccine distribution. So seems like the countries still don't seem to learn from previous mistakes. So what would be your direct message to the leadership of other countries to address the food crisis in the African continent right now?
Well, I think many countries have reserves. They should put those reserves at the disposal of the countries that are more in need. Some countries have export bans. They should remove those export bans. And at the same time, for many countries, the problem is not access to food, is resources to be able to buy it at the level of prices that we have. And so all the questions related to the different instruments that the IMF and the World Bank have need to be boosted in debt relief, in providing liquidity and allowing developing countries that are strangled financially at the present moment to be able to acquire the foodstuffs and the energy they need to maintain the minimum, the bare conditions that their populations need. If not, we risk to have a famine that the world has not known for several decades now.
You know, you have been in a unique position with the history of work that you've done. You've worked closely representing your country, you've worked in politics, and now currently you are, helming diplomacy. Do you believe currently where you stand that geopolitics is killing global governance?
Well, we cannot destroy what barely exists. Let's be clear. There was never a true global governance system, and much less a democratic one. We have, of course, a set of multilateral institutions, but the truth is that many have no teeth. Look at the World Health Organization, the World Health Organization. They have not the capacity even to investigate seriously the origins of COVID, and they have not the capacity to obtain information from everybody that is vital to organize a global response. And their proposals, their initiatives on vaccines, on treatments, etc., had to fight an enormous explosion of egoism that we have witnessed in the world. And those institutions that have this have little appetite to bite. The Security Council has this. But with the veto systems, the truth is that there are many situations, especially the most important situations, in which the Security Council is paralyzed. So the global governance system was not exactly working properly. And so I think we need to take profit of this occasion exactly to make people understand that we need global governance mechanisms, that there are global public goods that need to be managed with global governance mechanisms. And that is the objective of our Common Agenda initiative that was taken at the request of the members of the General Assembly last year, and in which there was a first round of consultations. We have an high-level panel led by the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister of Sweden and the former President of Liberia, exactly to look into what are the global public goods that have problems in the way the global interest is taken into account, and how can we adapt our institutions in order to be able to deliver in relation to that global governance, which means we need to transform this dramatic crisis into an opportunity to make people understand that what we had was not enough, that what we had was not working, and we need to seriously think about the reform of international coordination mechanisms. We must give them effective capacity of governance, at least in those areas that are critical, namely when we deal with climate, namely when we deal with pandemics that apparently nobody is able to control, and also that we can have a new agenda for peace, able to deal with a number of serious problems that we are facing, when we have seen it with the war in Ukraine. But also, I mean, we need to put order in the chaos of the cyberspace. We need to look into the outer space, which again, there is a situation of chaos developing. So there is time for us. The war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion has demonstrated that the mechanisms of governance we have are clearly not enough. And we need to seriously put on the table the reforms that are needed. It will not be easy. The geopolitical divides will make it complicated. I'm fully aware of that. But it's our duty to do everything, at least to tell the truth, and then to use the truth to make the changes or try to make the changes that are necessary.
Speaking of telling the truth, when you currently look at the failing decline of democratic institutions, the concerning decline of just democracy and where it stands on a global level, what are the few alarming signs that you are particularly concerned by, that you think more people should be talking about?
I think there are two very worrying trends. One is the increase of authoritarianism in many parts of the world. The idea of the strong man, normally not strong women, strong men. The reduction of space for the civil society. The dramatic problems faced by journalists in several countries around the world, where they risk to go to jail. Sometimes they put their lives at risk. So this is one set of problems. And then we have the difficulties that democracies are facing at the present moment to deal, namely, with technological evolution, to deal with all the changes in social relations for which many times our democratic institutions are not entirely prepared. Look at the role of social media and the way misinformation is today permanently used with much stronger capacity than in the past. Look into how irrationality has been emerging. I mean, I am European, even if my function today is universal, but I'm proud of the Enlightenment, the contribution of Europe to global civilization. Now those values of the Enlightenment are put into question. Irrationality in xenophobia, in racism, irrationality in the hatred for the foreigner, the hatred for the migrant, the hatred for the refugee, but also the polarization of societies. I mean, the space of social media fragmented. The people in one side of the spectrum only dealing with other people in that side of the spectrum, and the same with the second side, which society is more and more divided. So we need to fight authoritarianism, but we need at the same time to look seriously how we can improve, how we can reform our democratic institutions to be able to cope with the challenges of the present times.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. I want to take a question from someone from the Paris Peace Forum community that we have joining us, Salih Booker, the Senior Program Officer of International Programs at the Ford Foundation. And over to you, Salih, for the question.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your leadership in attempting to design a global common agenda. This question is about inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated deep structural inequality, and it has exacerbated inequality worldwide. In your recent remarks at the Least Developed Countries Conference, you warned against a two-tiered recovery from COVID-19, and you identified a morally bankrupt global financial system designed by the rich and powerful to benefit the rich and powerful as a major structural driver of global economic inequality. What then are the next steps in global governance terms necessary to end the pandemic equitably and to urgently address the looming debt crisis of poor countries? Because at this time, when greater international cooperation is needed, more countries are turning inward. So what are the incentives for the wealthiest countries to acknowledge and participate in dismantling this unequal structural world order that increasingly resembles a kind of global apartheid? Thank you.
Well, there are many examples of solidarity, and solidarity is a value that is fundamental from my perspective of the world. But I think if we count only on solidarity, we'll probably be doomed because egoism is also there. So we need people to understand in an enlightened way what their self-interest is. And developed countries are now themselves facing the consequences of inequality. I mean, this pandemic was not eradicated as it could have been if vaccines on time would have been given to everybody everywhere. That would, of course, limit the creation of new variants. And we are at the risk of the situation in which at the end of this year, all the vaccines that we have received and distributed in the developed world will probably become not relevant anymore, which means that the inequality that was imposed in the vaccine distribution system is now creating a major threat for developed countries in the future. Then the inequality that we have seen in relation to the resources available for countries in the developing world is now feeding unrest. We have seen recently Sri Lanka, Pakistan, we have seen coup d'etats in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and this is creating an environment in which there will be more massive migration, an environment in which there will be conflicts emerging, and conflicts now are coming to the center of the developed world. So, I mean, this egoism has proven to be a kind of a suicidal approach. And then one other thing that is obvious, when one looks at climate change, now climate change is not only a problem for developing countries. We see dramatic consequences in public health. We see dramatic consequences in infrastructure in developed countries themselves. So the inequality that was embedded in our system from the beginning, it's not something created recently, it was embedded in the system. Many people would say 10, 20 years ago that inequality is a factor of development. We need to concentrate resources to have investment, and that is what will allow for progress. No, so inequality was part of the way the system was designed. Now inequality became an obstacle for the system to work. And so we need to do reforms. We need to do reforms in relation to the international financial institutions. It's unacceptable, the role that is played today by credit rating agencies with a very biased approach that totally undermines the situation of developing countries. We need to make sure that the financial institutions that exist correspond to what the world is today and not what the world was after the Second World War. But at the same time, we need to take profit of what exists now. I mean, special drawing rights were distributed, but they were distributed proportionally to the quotas. They must be redistributed based on needs. And unfortunately, the redistribution until now is very small. Everybody thought that debt relief was important, but we had the suspension just for least developed countries, and it was a suspension. And the so-called framework for debt relief did not work. It was so complicated, so bureaucratic, and so limited. Only 3 countries became candidates, and there was no debt relief available, especially for middle-income countries. And look at the small island developing states. They are middle-income countries. They are under the pressure of the COVID. They are under the pressure of climate change. Tourism has evaporated in many of them, and they are in a dramatic situation. But as they are middle-income country, they don't need to have concessional financial support. So we need to rethink all these mechanisms. We need to make them work. In providing liquidity in a much more fair way and in addressing debt relief in a much more serious way. And we have the instruments to do that. So we need a basic reform of the global financial system, but we cannot wait for that. The dramatic situation in developing countries is such that we need to use the instruments that now exist to put them to work quickly and to boost their capacity, oriented them to those that are more in risk of a collapse that would, in the end, undermine our global order.
Thank you, Secretary General, and thank you, Salih, for your question. I now want to introduce Fatmé Masri, who's the Project Director of Arab Reform Initiative. Fatmé, over to you for your question, please.
Thank you. As a Think and Do tank, our key mission is to articulate a homegrown agenda for democratic change and social justice in Arab countries. One of our key work pillars is on women's political participation in the MENA region. to enable an inclusive women-owned approach and vision for what a feminist peace looks like in conflict-affected countries. We do this through providing a leading platform for perspectives and voices of Arab women who don't usually have access to policymakers, and an emerging network of activists, researchers, and policymakers rethinking women political participation by making sure that it is inclusive. A myriad of female activists we engage with from the MENA region proclaim they're not meaningfully included and represented in negotiations and mediation political efforts. My question to you, Secretary General, is twofold. How can we progress from symbolic and quantitative women's inclusion in high-level peace processes to achieve well-founded feminist policies with meaningful impact? And how will the UN ensure adequate resources towards such efforts in light of changing global priorities as a result of the war in Ukraine?
Well, let's be clear. This is a question of power. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. And so the central question is how to change power relations. And to change power relations, I think women must take them. I mean, power is never given, it is taken. And we need to use your allies in my side of the world in order to make sure that we work together to really change power relations effectively. Now, what we did here in the UN, the first thing I did was to make sure that we had parity, full parity at decision-making level. We have 190 senior leaders in the UN. Now we have full parity, more than 50 women, by the way, than men. We had less than 1/3 just 5 years ago. And the same battle needs to exist in all governments, in all parliaments, in all boards of all companies. And this question of power needs to be on the center of everything we do. And obviously, one thing that is essential is in relation to the peace and security architecture. If there is something where these power relations are more against women, is in the peace and security architecture. I mean, military institutions, the concept of war, everything else, I mean, is the product of a male-dominated world. And so it has been very difficult to have women playing an important role on that. I'm proud that now we have also not only parity at the level of higher decision-making level in the UN, but we managed to have parity in the heads of the missions and the deputy heads of the missions, which means we have a woman in charge of our mission in Afghanistan. We have a woman in charge of our mission in Iraq. We have a woman in charge of our mission in Central African Republic. We have a woman in charge of our mission in the DRC. So we need to push for women to play a decisive role in peace missions and to push for women to be represented in mediation efforts. And that, I must tell you, is a very tough thing. When I try to convince the Libyans to sit together, men delegations come, and we need to force them to have women delegations. I remember in negotiations of Yemen, long time ago in Stockholm, no women were there. So we need to bring women through civil society consultations. So this is still a very tough situation, and we need to fight it with all our forces. And when one looks at the war in Ukraine, one thing I'm absolutely sure, if we had women taking decisions, key decisions, I don't think we would have had the war in Ukraine. I don't think we have had the Russian invasion.
I just want to give you the final word with this question that I'm going to throw at you. Something that you said recently in an interview really struck me when you said that the war will not end in meetings, it will end when the Russian Federation decides to end it. So to the people listening, what is the role of we, the people, when it comes to ending this war, reestablishing order of peace? What would your final send-off message be to the people listening to you?
I think we need to do everything possible for the war to end. I need to go on insisting with the need for the war to end, for troops to go back to their barracks. But as the war goes on raging, we need to do everything possible to uphold international humanitarian law, to make sure humanitarian work works, to create the conditions to minimize its impact in the most poor around the world, and at the same time, to create mechanisms of accountability. I think that the strength of mechanisms of accountability is the best way to prevent future wars like this one.
Thank you so much. And thank you for continuing to lead with moral fortitude and courage to speak the truth during these times of grave crisis. We look forward to your continued leadership. Thank you so much, Secretary General, for your time.
It was a pleasure to participate, and I wish you all the success in the Peace Forum.
You just heard a discussion with Secretary General Guterres from the UN, conducted by Trisha Shetty, our own chair of the steering committee of the Paris Peace Forum. So we're continuing on our program of the spring meeting of the forum. We'll have now two panels, one from 4 to 5 p.m., which I will have the pleasure to moderate, will be on how we can preserve global cooperation in times of war. Then at 5 p.m., Pascal Lamy, the president of the forum, will moderate a second panel on the looming food security question with an array of important international organizations. But let me now focus on the topic that we will be dealing with in the next hour. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a dramatic humanitarian crisis and to the worst population movement across Europe since World War II. But on top of these direct effects and consequences, there are indirect effects, as articulated by the Executive Committee of the Paris Peace Forum in March. The war also threatens cooperation on many critical areas, notably the biggest challenge that humanity faces, from climate, obviously, to loss of biodiversity, but also to pandemic recovery and pandemic preparedness, but also the race to reach the SDGs and an array of cooperations that we take for granted on the oceans, on outer space, on the poles, etc. Not to mention, obviously, the disruption of the world economy and the rises in energy and food prices. So the question is, how do we manage the direct consequences of the war, but also how do we avoid a fallout, an indirect impact on global cooperation? That's what the current panel will address. Which areas of global governance are the most impacted? What mechanisms could we use to preserve global cooperation? How do we avoid a north-south gap, north-south divide, and also more importantly, perhaps an east-west split on issues that are of universal concern? In other words, how do we protect global governance from geopolitics? To address this issue, I have an array of fantastic speakers. I'm really glad to be joined by 5 outstanding personalities. First, I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First, Ilona Sabo, who's the co-founder and president of the Igarapé Institute in Brazil. She's a member of the UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. I'm also joined by Henry Wang, who's the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. From Europe, I'm joined by Koen Doens, who's the Director General of INTPA, the International Partnerships Directorate at the European Commission. I'm also joined from Paris, from here, by Arantxa González, who's the Dean of PSIA, the Paris School for International Affairs at Sciences Po. And lastly, by Nathalie Samarasinghe, who's the Global Director for Advocacy at the Open Society Foundations. Ilona, let me start with you. You were recently appointed to the panel I just mentioned, to the UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. Doesn't the war change a bit the mission or even perhaps the meaning of the board?
So thank you very much. I apologize for the background noise. I'm joining you from Davos. But it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. So on your question, I would argue the opposite, but let me first explain the role of the board, because I think it's a new board. So it's important that everyone understands. So the high-level board, high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism is a flagship initiative in the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda, which aims to produce recommendations precisely to reimagine and revitalize multilateralism. So the board will propose options for global governance improvements for key issues of global concern. So these recommendations have a common aim: to seek greater equity, fairness, and effectiveness in global decision-making. And what has become very clear to us so far is that there are many areas, but I will just include and highlight peace and security, climate, global finance, where global governance arrangements need to be improved. So in this sense, the war just makes the call for more efficient multilateralism more urgent, very, very urgent. And that said, it's important to acknowledge that even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we faced very serious geopolitical challenges. So in an increasingly multipolar world, we're also facing economic decoupling, which was sped up during COVID as supply chains vulnerabilities became very apparent. We're also facing the risk of digital fragmentation, with China, Russia, and the West essentially creating their own internet. And when we add to this the rising instance of climate shocks and stresses, we can say that we are at this very dangerous juncture in the history of our civilization. So given all these major global challenges, progress, as you mentioned, on the SDGs appears to have stalled. We're seeing rising inequalities and a whole range of human development indicators going into reverse. So the war, in the sense, is just making a bad problem worse, and we urgently need a way out. So we understand that our current multilateral frameworks need to be upgraded to address the systemic and compounding challenges and risks, and starting within the UN. So I would say that the veto initiative was an important call for shared responsibility, should just be the start. We need to go further. And I would say that at the high level board, we're guided by this vision of a multilateralism that is more inclusive and networked. And we can speak more about that. And the multilateralism that just bring different stakeholders together in arrangements that speak not only to state interests, but to the needs and aspiration of the peoples and communities. So I'll stop here, but let's dig into this in more detail.
Thank you, Ilona. Henry, let me turn to you. Henry Wang is the president of the Center for China and Globalization. China seems to be erring on the side of caution, I guess I could say, almost introversion, right, in the recent month, because of COVID, because of Ukraine, and perhaps because of the 20th Congress that is upcoming later this year. Do you see Beijing's attitude changing vis-a-vis global cooperation at all?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And yes, really great to be on this panel. I think that with the given changing geopolitical situation, and also given the tension actually going on in the world, I think China still wants to stick to multilateralism as far as China is concerned. For example, China is really aimed at join all those open economic system. China still wants to have support the WTO reform. China is actually joined the RCEP, the largest free trade agreement in the world now. China applied to join CPTPP. I think that I may also personally think that China probably open to this Indo-Pacific economic framework if it's really want to tackle climate change and all those new initiatives that China could be a part of that. But also China is really still working on this Belt Initiative. But again, I think the world is really geared to the more tension, and then there's more geopolitical conflict, like the war happened in Ukraine right now. So we see this more security alliance that's going on. That we have, of course, NATO expanding, and then we have Five Eyes, we have AUKUS, which is in the Pacific region, and we have Quad, and so all those military or security alliance could be really sending some alarm signal that maybe the world is divided into camps. So I think for China, as far as we can see, is China still wants to stick to the UN Charter. The national sovereignty, territorial integrity should be respected, and China is also now having a difficulty to combat this COVID because it's coming back, and China has 1.4 billion people. So they experiment all kinds of mechanisms to tackle that. But I'm sure, as long as China contains this, China will open again and welcome, all the international friends, business coming to China. And also, I think Paris Peace Forum is doing great to sending out all those new messages and new multilateralism, which I think China is really wants to support and wants to be part of that.
Thank you, Henry. Koen, let me turn to you. I remind you that Koen Doens is the Director General of INTPA at the European Commission. Most developing countries have not followed the issue regarding the sanctions on Russia, and many, including in Africa, even abstained from condemning its violation of the UN Charter. Has Europe lost Africa? Has Europe lost the developing world in general, Koen?
Well, thanks a lot, Justin, for having me and asking me such a blunt question, which begs for a blunt answer. I don't think that international relations are a game where you win or lose pawns. So in my view, I disagree with the question as if it's about winning or losing other countries. We're not back at the Cold War. This is not the West versus the rest. I'm the general for INTPA, which is the acronym for international partnerships, and I think that that's exactly what it's about. I think making the case for the values of a multilateral system, that's the discussion we are in, and I think that Russia's war against Ukraine precisely questions strongly, in the most brutal possible way, rules-based multilateral system. I think that's the discussion we are having.
Koen, I think we've lost you. The connection doesn't seem so great. Let's wait a few seconds to see if you come back. Brussels is not so far, but apparently we have a slight technical issue. Maybe we could come even closer to home and ask Arantxa perhaps to take the floor. Arantxa, you had a great piece in the FT. Let me remind the audience that you are the Dean of the Paris School for International Affairs after having been, obviously the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain. And in that piece, you advocated for keeping the one of the institutions of globalization intact, that's the WTO. But more generally, how do you see the war playing out on Russia's attitude and on the other countries' attitude, and how could that impact the way we do multilateralism and the way globalization works?
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you to the Paris Peace Forum for this opportunity to debate an issue that is very close to my heart. It is true that the war in Ukraine has accentuated pre-existing difficulties in the international system. It has basically brought to the fore many of the problems we were facing in finding cooperative solutions to many of the challenges that the world face. And it's interesting to see, by the way, that this war took us a little bit by surprise. We were, in a way, focusing more on the Pacific. We were focusing more on the fight on the geopolitical conflict between China and the United States. We were looking at technology as the epicenter of this discussion. And all of a sudden, this has turned into again, the Atlantic, and a territory that has known these conflicts in the past, a conflict between Russia and another European country, Ukraine, and an epicenter of this conflict in very old traditional territory, which is sovereignty and territorial integrity. Maybe for all of us to realize that what we thought we had left behind in the past is still with us. Now, the challenge we have today in this much more geopolitical world, in this international system that is more powered by power, by force, is how do we find the spaces that we need to advance issues that belong to all nations, whether it's climate change, whether it's protection of the oceans, whether it's world's financial stability, whether it's feeding humanity. All of these are going to require cooperative approaches. And this is where the narrative we need to continue to insist on is not one of division or fragmentation, is a narrative of coming together to fix this for the problems that we all face. We don't necessarily have to like each other, but we need to be very clear that if we do not work together, those challenges will not be addressed. And if they are not addressed, nobody will be sheltered from the impact of climate change, from the impact of greater insecurity, from the impact of pandemics, to name but a few. So narrative that builds on the need to work together is something that we need to insist on. Back to you, Justin.
Thank you. But Arantxa, can I push you just a bit further, right? Because you said we don't need to like each other to cooperate with one another. And I agree with that. But it seems to me we have another challenge on our hands, which is that it's not just about liking or disliking one another. It's also about a violation of one of the most fundamental rules of the UN Charter, right? Don't invade your neighbor. And whatever we might think about Russia, it's true that there has been a blatant violation. And so the question I would put to you, and I will put to the others later on, is we've seen at the WTO that there was a walkout from, or at the G20, that there were walkouts from the room when the Russian representative was speaking, thereby preventing these discussions from going forward, etc. Do you think this is warranted? Do you think that's what should be done because the violation is so grave? Or do you think we should nonetheless do as if nothing had happened and simply keep discussing and negotiating with the Russians?
No, I don't think we can do as if nothing had happened. And actually, we are not doing as if something had not happened. We have all taken individually as an international community too. And it was reflected very clearly in the first vote that the UN took on this matter, that the international community, by a large, I would say, overwhelming number of countries in the international community reject the idea that countries can return to the past in terms of violating territorial integrity, violating sovereign rights, and using war as a means to achieve gains. We have been very clear that this is not acceptable. And we have reacted to this. The question is whether we stop the international places where we still have to continue to talk about climate change, protection of the oceans, fisheries, and the rest. And I think we have to be able to do the two, express our utmost disgust at what has happened, take the necessary measures, use the instruments at our disposal in the international community, from international courts of justice to the use of every instrument at our disposal, but also continue to work together. Now, maybe we cannot do this by meeting directly with some of the members of the international community, but there are ways and ways for diplomats to keep talking, even in the worst of circumstances. This is also what we have learned from history, Justin.
Thanks, Arantxa. I'm very glad to see that Koen has returned, but Koen, before I get back to you so you can complete your thoughts, I'd like to ask a question to Nathalie Samarasinghe from OSF, because we've been talking about governments so far, and global cooperation is more than just among governments. It's a system of cooperation that spans the local, the national, the regional, and the global. Civil society is essential at many levels and has very often different opinions and a strong voice for reform. And so the question I would have for you, Nathalie, is what are the ways in which we can use this moment of tension to improve global cooperation differently from what governments do?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for that question. And I think, a short answer is we need to make global cooperation and fixing it a priority. At present, we seem to be trapped in a spiral of crises. And for some, it is very hard to see solutions. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the obvious one. But for others, climate, COVID, debt, we actually have solutions and at least good starting points in the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance. But we are not moving forward because global cooperation is just not a priority. And I understand why. as a policymaker facing multiple crises, it's not at the top of your list, or as a community organizer looking at what's happening in your city, it's not top of your list. But what happens? A crisis arrives, and then the global system we all say is broken becomes our only option. So we try to use it. Sometimes we even try to fix it, but then the moment passes. The politics is too difficult. The next crisis comes, and we're back at the beginning. So, we at Open Society, I think we really hope that after we fail to get it right for COVID, after we fail to get it right for climate so far, we won't let this moment pass. Because I think the Secretary General alluded to this, the people in Ukraine know that even when the international system works, when there's global condemnation, when humanitarian appeals are met, when refugees are welcomed, when you see stakeholders from all sectors come together on sanctions, it's not enough. And there are many conflicts when these options are not even on the table. So what does that mean? I mean, it means we need to make global cooperation better. And the key way to do that is to make it more inclusive. So that means moving forward with things such as the Secretary General's emergency platform, so that we're not scrambling to try and build coalitions in the middle of a crisis. That means looking at the multi-stakeholder mechanisms that do work well, the Global Fund, the Montreal Protocol, and thinking about how can we apply them to the global public goods that Ilona was referring to. That means bringing civil society and the public into multilateral forums properly, not for the occasional event, not to make ourselves feel good, but to ensure that there is ongoing consultation, input, expertise, and accountability, because otherwise the gap between what we need globally and what is politically feasible domestically is very large. And that means also rethinking our approach to global burden sharing. And there are many practical ways to do this: empowering the General Assembly, changing the focus of our IFIs, and recognizing ultimately that developing countries bear the brunt of our failures. And that sending a very small amount of aid isn't enough when they're hosting most of the world's refugees, when we in the rich world literally send our trash to their shores, and when large countries are able to use the international system to their benefit in a world where a large country can invade its neighbor. And finally, that means, I think, putting real measures on the table at the upcoming G7, G20, and UN meetings to address the food, debt, and energy crisis and show that the system can work. And we need to do that in consultation with the most vulnerable.
Thank you, Natalie. Really interesting leads, and of course the message of reforming multilateralism and relying more on multi-actor platforms goes straight to the heart of the Paris Peace Forum, since that's an essential part of our DNA. Kun, I'm really glad you could join us back. You were saying that you were refusing the way I was asking my question about winning or losing countries. And obviously, I must admit that I agree with you, but I'll let you now elaborate on this.
Thanks, Justin. And I'm sure that that my refusing that question was not the reason why I was kicked out. It seems my IT environment is even more unstable than global governance. But the point that I was making really is that we are in this very important discussion on making the case for the international values around which a rules-based global order is built. And I think that we have seen how the vast majority of countries across the globe see the absolute merits of this rules-based multilateral system, without which basically we'd be living in a world where might makes right. You were referring to UNGA, and actually what I think the UNGA votes have clearly shown is that they were very successful in underlying the rejection by the international community of Russia's aggression. Ultimately, only 5 countries voted with Russia. When it comes to the abstentions, I mean, I think there must be an understanding that in a multipolar world, each country has to balance its relations with a wide spectrum of interest. It's not all that binary or black and white, and we must not fall, I think, into the trap of starting to condemn nations that are not fully aligned with us. I think there's a maturity needed in global governance that allows us to understand these kind of nuances that are behind abstentions. And I think continuing that kind of conversation is absolutely very basic, but also at the heart of what I was referring to, which is international cooperation, international partnerships. And so taking time to understand and relate to to others, which brings me to my third point, which is that obviously, I mean, Russia's invasion is a defining moment for Europe. It brings war back to the European continent, and therefore it's a top priority for the European Union. We are mobilizing to support Ukraine. We are mobilizing to sanction Russia, but that does not mean that we forget about the rest of the world. On the contrary, there's a third strand of our action that is really looking at how we can mobilize in support of other partners. And we do that in the first place to rally and help them cope with the immediate negative impact, notably on food, on price inflation, on humanitarian needs, and so on. But we're also keen, and I heard Natalie refer to that and Ilona as well, very keen to keep the action we have, the partnership we have on those defining trends of our time: climate, digitization, socioeconomic inequalities, to keep that firmly on the agenda. And I may have the occasion further down the debate to come back to Global Gateway, which is the way in which we capture those relations between the European Union, our member states, Team Europe, and the rest of the world to basically partner on how we tackle those big transformative global challenges that are so much marking our 21st century.
Thanks, Koen. If we are to keep global cooperation on track, we need to agree on a number of rules. And one of the things you said, one of the expressions you used was the rules-based international order. I'd like to ask both Henry and Ilona, so China and Brazil, in a sense, if that rules-based international order resonates in the same way in their respective countries as they do here in Europe. Henry, perhaps?
Yes, thank you, Justin. And no, I think that absolutely, you know, that China actually enjoyed greatly joining the international system. I mean, opening up 44 decades ago symbolized China really embraced the global system, and also China has completed 2 Olympics. Again, another event that embraced the global system and globalization. I think China joined WTO is also a big event that has actually benefited not only China but also the world. China now contributes 1/3 of global GDP growth and become the largest trading nation with 130 countries. And China continued, and also lifted 800 million people out of poverty. 10 years ahead of the time, realizing SDG 2030 agenda, alleviating poverty. So I think there's many benefits of the joining this global system. And again, now we are seeing this global system is under some challenge now, should I say, because we see the military security is really taking the theme of the day, and the military budget has gone up, and the situation is getting really risky. I mean, particularly after this Russian invasion of. So what I think is that maybe we should promote economic globalization continuously, inclusively. Let's set up a more economic alliance, like, I mean, also this Indian Pacific economic framework. If it's economically benefiting, I mean, China should be part of that, and it should really be great. But also China should reason, now with the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner going to visit China and actually landed in China already. We hope that we can continue the comprehensive investment treaty with EU that has been signed. Another thing I see that we can really seek common ground. I know that China, John Kerry, U.S. envoy on climate change, and China Minister Xie Zhenhua is meeting in Dallas now and talking about climate change, where we have signed agreement on that. And also, again, and we could do things like infrastructure. We have heard our EU panelists just mentioned about this global gateway that the EU had announced 300 billion euro to support that, and President Trump announced 1.2 trillion to support that. And then, of course, China has an even bigger budget for that Belt and Road. Why can't we have AIB, World Bank, and AFDB, Inter-American Development Bank, all banks, development banks work together to support the global, initiative on the infrastructure. So we need to find a common ground in climate change and infrastructure, pandemic fighting. Again, we need a WHO really taking some leadership, propose some international guidelines and travel lifting measures that we can really promote in, and also migration, talent flow, many themes. I think that which is Paris Peace Forum is really aimed at to promote this multilateral system. So we want to strengthen that. I think China wants to be really part of that and avoid this kind of geopolitical tension like AUKUS, Quad, Five Eyes, or mini NATO in Asia, things like that. We really need to avoid that.
Thank you, Henry. Ilona, now turning to you, rules-based international order, how does that resonate in your ears? And do we agree on a sufficient large basis of rules and perhaps values?
Sure. So I would say that traditionally Brazil is a strong and supporter and believer of the international order, and I think helped to build part of this architecture very firmly. But that to say also that we are facing challenge to our democracy at the moment. So there is a little bit of dissonance between what's, let's say, the history and the legacy of our foreign affairs work and what the government also, the government in place today, communicates. So I would say it's, I would like to reiterate that the country per se is a country that wants to be part of the international order, and we hope that we'll be back with more, let's say, impetus to defend the issues of global concern and to also participate in this discussion of how to reinvigorate multilateralism. But just that said, I think it's very important to notice that, I think Koen mentioned that, but not every government saw the NATO expansion as improving global peace and security. So in the developing world, this was, mixed feelings. So there is this legacy of mistrust, resistance in many countries across the Americas, Africa, even Asia, to what is seen as the Western hegemony. And so we see this very strong in the BRICS. So we need to understand that their positions are shaped by complex historical, political, economic factors, like linked to national interest, but also to this pursuit of what was mentioned here of a multipolar world. But that said, also it's important to note that the Russian-Ukraine war is in a context of a global decline of democracy. So we are seeing the rise of autocracies, not least in the global south. So challenges in the global south, also in the northern countries, people are growing increasingly frustrated, afraid, angry, and I think this is further dividing our populations and undermining democracies that we should really care about. So I think we are in a negative feedback loop, and the more we see setbacks in the SDGs, for instance, the more this can reinforce regressive politics, instability, climate inactivism, and so on. So I think we have, let's say, one more issue to tackle, which is how to build trust in democracy, in cooperation, in a very divided and polarized world.
I think the point on trust is really key on the basis on which we can agree. And that leads me back to Nathalie, obviously, because OSF has been a big proponent of actions in the global south, from Afghanistan to Africa. But people in the global south, many don't see what has happened in Ukraine the same way that we see and that you and I at OSF or at Paris Peace Forum see how things develop. So you talked earlier about the more networked multilateralism, but could you elaborate on what's that fabric of how civil society can actually bridge these gaps, bridge the gap of trust among populations in the BRICS, for example, and in Europe or elsewhere, and how that can help preserve global cooperation?
I think, the issue of trust is absolutely key, and it goes to the heart of it. And I think here, OSF is global. I mean, we're not a global north organization. We are in touch with colleagues and partners across the world. And there is a strong, genuine sense of horror, compassion, and solidarity with people in Ukraine. But there's also a question about double standards, about the failure to address long-standing conflicts and needs, COVID most obviously, but also climate change. There's a history of failure there. So I think, for us, we're thinking about how can we use this moment of exceptionalism for Ukraine, because as I said before, it's still not working for Ukraine, but also for other countries and other situations. So it becomes a situation of Ukraine and not Ukraine or. And the key, I think, to doing that is delivery. Both Henry and Ilona alluded to it in different ways. I think the key to restoring trust in the global system is making it work with tangible results on the ground. And that is also the key really to making democracy work. So engaging those groups that feel, for many reasons, marginalized. And I think here, delivery needs to be accompanied by a new narrative, and that goes to the point on values. So, I am convinced, having in many different capacities done sort of similar exercises and consultations, that we would come up with a very similar system of values to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. But the system we're creating to build and take forward these values is, as Mr. Guterres said, inherently flawed. So it is about looking at having that kind of conversation around what is the nature of, in the West, we would say social contract. What does that mean in other parts of the world? And how can we look at multiplying and scaling up all the work that is happening at a community level in a way that really makes sure that our efforts are grounded in that expertise? And here, philanthropy has a role to play. I don't want to overstate it, but we see our role as catalytic. So we can take risks, we can innovate, we can fund the types of groups that might find it hard to support. But ultimately, everything we're doing in many ways is plugging a gap that should be filled by governments and by global systems and by communities. So we want to use our investments as a bridge to sustainable action by those communities. And a couple of examples, we rallied with other funders to launch something called the Ukraine Democracy Fund, knowing that the humanitarian support would be there, but what about support to human rights, media freedom, anti-corruption, civil society, all the things we were funding before in Ukraine. And another example is we worked with other funders, a sort of alliance of foundations, to not only increase access to vaccines, but also to support manufacturing capacity in the global south, because that we feel is the game changer. So it's not just about solidarity, but about justice and empowerment as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Arantxa, let's get back to the Westphalian world, if you will, because I'm interested in the piece you published in the FT, the op-ed, and more precisely the question of where globalization is going. We've all read that it was either deglobalization or a different type of globalization. Janet Yellen has spoken about friendshoring, that is to say, reducing the value chains to friendly countries because of the importance of geopolitics there. So my question would be, what is your prescription, what is your recommendation to avoid further fragmentation, especially of the trade world, and how should we navigate the choppy waters of the Ukraine war as it relates to trade? How should we act at the WTO and in the other instances from your perspective?
Well, one thing I see is globalization in terms of greater connectivity, whether it's greater connectivity on goods, on services, on people movement, on capital movement, on cultural exchanges, continuing to advance, driven mostly by technology. Technological progress is connecting us ever more. What we have not seen, and this is why I don't believe in the theory of deglobalization, what we have not seen is better rules to manage this ever more globalized world, better rules that will help us manage these interdependencies that we have today. I am very mindful of the very hard law of economics. And the hard laws of economics are very stubborn. Comparative advantages are very stubborn. So what we have to do is not to deny that these comparative advantages or these laws of economics exist, but trying to harness our interdependence. So moving forward, in my view, the best thing we can do to protect the spirit of multilateral cooperation, to protect multilateralism, against the risk of fragmentation, but still respond to the clear questions that this more globalized world without enough rules has posed, is to build resilience. And that is going to be this word, this resilience will matter even more. It will matter even more in countries, it will matter even more in societies, in political systems, and it will matter even more for governments as they have to manage their own interdependence. Now, what this resilience means, it doesn't mean unplugging from the global economy. It means making sure that we identify the risk and we take measures to balance those risks. In Europe, we know, for example, that this means making sure that we diversify. That's not that we retreat from the world, is we diversify so that we are not dependent on a single source of supply. If we look at climate change, it will mean building systems that will withstand the impact that climate has on them, from infrastructure to a better and more resilient agriculture, and so on and so forth. But in this much more resilient multilateralism, which is what we need to look for in the future, one thing is clear, Justin, is that it cannot be purely Westphalian. It cannot be a system that is built only by states for states. It has to include many more actors. It will only be resilient if it includes the variety of actors on the international scene that can help us in building governance. Let me give you a very telegraphic example. Climate change. We saw what the exit of Donald Trump from the climate change accord meant to all of us. But we also saw that when the state withdrew from the climate change accord, many other actors in the US stepped in to fill in the gap. Businesses stepped in, states stepped in, mayors stepped in. So we need a much more resilient multilateralism, and this means bringing all the relevant stakeholders around the table, not only the states. So we, in a way, need to reinvent a post-Westphalian multilateral system.
In a sense, this post-Westphalian multilateral system is also based on what Koen described earlier as a results-oriented, right? We need to make sure, if we are to share more, not only more rules, but also more values, that is to say, agree that certain values are desirable, and that we need to make sure that, for example, countries in the global south don't suffer disproportionately from food insecurity, from the rise of fuel prices, from inflation, from excessive debt, etc. We need to have a sort of an effective multilateralism. However, the question remains, how do we balance, on the one hand, the necessity to keep global rules and to have sanctions, in a sense, for those who don't respect them, with universality? And Koen, perhaps earlier, Arantxa said that we needed to do both at the same time. That is, signal that we strongly disapproved Russia's conduct, and on the other hand, keep discussing. In November, there will be not only the Paris Peace Forum, really important, but a few days afterwards, there will be the G20 in Bali, in Indonesia. And we know that, obviously, this is one of the clubs in which global governance is done and in which we can push global cooperation further. We also know that Indonesians have invited President Zelensky there. So how important do you think is the G20 now, and how can it complement and how can we sort of balance these two divergent imperatives, do you think, at the G20? Should we go even though Mr. Putin is there? And what are your thoughts on that question?
Well, thanks, Justin. I think obviously that the G20 remains a very, very important international forum, precisely because it gathers the set of countries that are members of the G20 in a forum where these big issues can be discussed. And it's critical because I think that, I mean, as we've said before, we are, I mean, we were already prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but certainly after it, really confronted with this kind of questioning indeed on the rules-based order, on democracy and the values for it. And I think sometimes it's actually useful to not to run away from that discussion, but to maybe be confronted with what we have been taking for granted and revisit precisely why it's worthwhile. I think, and I just want to pick up on a point that I think Nathalie made on the whole issue of trust in democracy, the importance of it, and how it's more and more being questioned, and we see a rollback against the alternative of strongmen. I've always admired this book written by Darren Akemoglu and James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, that very nicely sets out how critical and how difficult an exercise liberal democracy is, basically requiring, it's a balancing act between strong enough institutions and strong enough a civil society. And it's the dance between these two that makes a democracy, a liberal democracy, healthy. And I think we're looking at something similar at the global level, where it is never just fixed for always, but a constant balancing act, but based on those rules that we stand for. I keep referring that doing away with it means creating a world where might makes right. And I think that as we continue this conversation, the big majority of the global community will see the clear benefits of having a rules-based order, one where these rules are set. I want to make the link with the point that Arantxa made. I mean, in this multipolar world that we are shaping, obviously we don't automatically all see eye to eye, but just as in psychology, we know that you need a certain degree of self-confidence as individual if you want to establish and develop proper mature relations with other people. I think something similar is true in a multipolar world. Probably we need to have a situation where these poles in the multipolar world build up the kind of resilience, the kind of strength, the kind of what we could call open strategic autonomy as a premise for mature engagement with the rest of the world. And basically what we're trying to do with Global Gateway is exactly that, is not to create partnerships based on dependencies of other parts of the world, but basically creating links with other parts of the world. And again, I think that's really important then to keep in mind. I mean, some of the complexes from the past, this historic legacy that we need to be aware of as we build these partnerships with the rest of the world. Ultimately, and I think that that's the key point, is what we should all constantly keep in mind is that there are global challenges out there that ultimately will defeat us all if we act in a fragmented way upon them. And that's definitely true for climate change, but I think that's also true for what is happening on technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. And it is also true for what is happening on inequalities. And I think keeping those big global challenges somehow as guiding stars should help us to shape that kind of global governance that is needed. If it all falls apart, we will ultimately all lose.
Thank you, Koen. We just have a few minutes left, and so I'm going to challenge the speakers a bit and do a last round of one question with short answers. And that is based on the reflection that obviously we all fear that geopolitics might kill global governance, right? That's the overall theme of today's panel. So I'd like to know what makes you optimistic, or what you think is the way in which we can escape that fate of geopolitics fracturing the world and making global cooperation impossible, and that each of you would outline one thing that he or she thinks that it can make global cooperation more likely, or global cooperation better, or that he or she wishes to see happening in order to finish on a note of optimism. Arantxa, may I start with you?
So I was educated in the school of Jacques Delors, and he said, you are neither optimistic nor pessimistic, you are activistic. So I challenge all of us to be activistic for multilateralism. This is what I'm modestly trying to do now for the upcoming WTO Ministerial Conference that will take place in June in Geneva, and where I think there is the possibility to conclude a deal to end harmful subsidies to fishing around the world, which would be a great contribution to protect the oceans. So from my new academic position, I am doing everything I can, working with many others, with conservationists around the world, with governments who want to see this happen, with the younger generation, with activists, to make sure a deal is delivered, to show that multilateralism can work.
Excellent. Henry, what makes you optimistic, or what will save us from fragmentation?
Yeah, it's great to speak after Arantxa, because she was the assistant DG of the WTO. What I can see is that after Second World War, the trade has gone up everywhere in the world 500 times. You know that we've been really living a prosperity war. We are totally intertwined, and we are living such a very abundant and healthy life than used to be. So I can't imagine which family is still going to send their kids to the war, to the battleground. You know, we are horrified by what happened in Ukraine. I mean, that reminds us we cannot go back to the 70, 80 years ago that we have a large world scale, conflict. So again, I would really think that we should strengthen this global governance system on the trade, on the World Bank, IMF, AIB, the Paris Peace Forum, so that really we can get multilateralism stay and continue resistantly, and so that we can really, resist this attempt of having a war around the world.
Paris Peace Forum is the answer I was waiting for. But more seriously, Natalie, over to you. What makes you optimistic, if anything?
Well, I mean, I think the issue is geopolitics can't kill global cooperation. I don't think that's a paradigm we should get into, because our lives literally depend on our ability to work together. I think, the way to fix it, but it is to bring in people, civil society, private, and, other actors, and bring them in as real partners in terms of decision-making, delivery, and funding. And I think we can start by convening these actors together and say, what can we start putting on the table now, from this summer through to September, through to the forum in November, the G20, and also COP. So let's have some concrete progress on, loss and damage. Let's have some progress on debt relief and debt cancellation, on SDRs, on food. These are the, let's start creating the sort of drumbeat towards the type of global cooperation we need.
Thanks. Koen, over to you.
Well, first of all, like Arantxa, I think we need to be activists. We need to stand up. There's a silent majority out there that needs to speak up more. Secondly, I think we've seen a number of actions. We tend to be focused on the negative and don't see the positive. You referred yourself, Justin, to the PPF. I will pick up something else, financing common. The work that is ongoing between a coalition of big financial institutions, banks, and so on, to try and define a common agenda around those global challenges that subsequently will channel the financial streams in support of the SDGs. I think these are very positive dynamics, which I'm very keen to support and which make me somehow, hopefully, activist.
Excellent. Ilona, we started with you. I'd like to end with you. What makes you optimistic that we can prevail over fragmentation?
So by nature, I'm an optimist, but also I think this kind of conversations that are becoming more diverse. I see women empowerment. I see young people at the table. I see indigenous groups. So people that are actually being heard for the first time, that are bringing the real issues, the urgency of the issues, and they are keeping us all accountable, even us from civil society. We need to reach out more for the voices that are not at the table and bring their voices alongside. So, I think that's what gives me hope, the energy and the activism of young people. I'm just like blown away by the power of them and kind of keeping, keep us first speak truth to power, but keep us all accountable. So let's bring them along, because it's about their lives, it's about the next generations. So we cannot fail. Like let's deliver.
Thank you, Lena. So if I summarize, so how can we preserve global cooperation from the war? And as I see Pascal Lamy arriving and soon joining me for the next panel, Arantxa said we need to be activistic rather than optimistic or pessimistic. Henry emphasized international organizations and the fact that they can still serve useful purpose. Natalie insisted on civil society. Koen insisted on the silent majority, but also on the mobilization of other actors like public development banks. And Ilona reminded us of people's mobilization and desire for accountability. So I think we have a good array of answers. And I hope one other answer, and I'm since Jacques Delors has been mentioned, I think Pascal, it's now time for you to join me here. I think one answer that we can give is the current mobilization around food security. So we're going to now thank you very much to the 5 of you, and we are going now to transition to the next panel with just a minute or two of pause, time enough to present the next panel. But Pascal, I'm happy to report that we solved the problem of fragmentation, and we found at least reasons for hope in this very bleak current environmental situation.
I'm very pleased to see that you only take panels with lots of my friends.
Absolutely. So thanks again. We'll be back in 1 minute. Pascal will be back for a really important panel on food security. And thanks again to the 5 of you for this current panel. C'est coupé le micro?
Oui, là, est-ce qu'on m'entend?
Hello, good morning, colleagues.
Yes.
Good morning.
Donc ça marche là?
Ouais.
Enhancing price as top CI, and thus in references and preferential contribution. Solidarity, because we need to put the whole ground.
So Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever time zone you are in. We've just seen this written message from the President of the French Republic, greeting us and underlining how important the topic we will now be dealing with in the next hour or so, which is this. That's the cover of this week's Economist. The title of our session was The Looming Food Crisis. The title of The Economist this week is The Coming Food Catastrophe. So I think we do not need a lot of diagnosis. We do not need a long description of why we are there or why we are going there, which is my personal conviction. This panel is about responses. It's about action. It's about what should be done insofar as it is not yet done at this stage. In order to contribute to this urgent, important, response-oriented conversation, we have a panel with many of my friends, starting with Mari Pangetsu from the World Bank. We will also have the pleasure of probably the first appearance of a new French minister, Madame Zakharopoulou, whom I remember I saw not long ago in the European Parliament, if I remember well. We have Jean-Marie Pogam from the World Trade Organization. We have Gabriel Ferrero from the UN World Food Committee, so all great specialists. We have a representative of the World Food Programme, Ute Klammer, very welcome, Ute. And we have Dominique Zellner, who's the Vice President of IFAD, the deputy of Mr. Hongbo. And last but not least, Joe Glauber, which I have just greeted in a previous session at the board of IFPRI, precisely dealing with this big food crisis issue, and very much welcome to Mr. Godfrey Baigwa from the EU Commission, who's also joining us for this conversation. Let me repeat, it's a conversation between you, I will moderate it, and the sort of party line which the Paris Peace Forum is giving to this conversation is response, solutions, what needs to be done. I repeat, we know the diagnosis, we know the catastrophe that is looming, we know roughly why. I don't think there's a lot of time to spend on the diagnosis. What should we do? What will you do? And what do you think you should do together? Mary, I'll ask you to start this discussion. Initial interventions are scheduled for roughly 3 minutes, so please keep this time constraint in mind, and then I will try to handle the conversation as a convergent way as possible. Marie, the floor is yours, and then I'll give the floor to the French minister, which I know has to leave us by 5:30 CET European times. Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pascal. Good to see everybody on this call. Let me just emphasize what we are doing. We are undertaking a comprehensive and we would like to say, coordinated global response to the ongoing food crisis. And it does need to be coordinated. I just wanted to emphasize that with other initiatives that are on the table, whether it's the Global Alliance for Food Security, which is just announced as a G7 initiative where we are co-leading with Germany, and the Farm Initiative of France. And of course, there's the UN Crisis Response Group and the pre-existing Global Agricultural Food Security Partnership, which was created in 2008, which is still ongoing and is a good platform for us to coordinate around. Let me just explain what the World Bank is doing. We just announced surge financing for our comprehensive global response of up to 30 billion for the next 15 months in new and existing financing for food and nutrition security. And it does focus what I would say is the major issues that we are facing. I would just say, highlight three major issues in this food and nutrition insecurity that we are facing today. One is, I think food is available. If you look at the production, it's actually slightly higher than 2021. The issue is distribution and logistics and excessive stock holdings as well as export restrictions. Second, fertilizers is an issue. This was not an issue in the 2008 crisis, but availability and price of fertilizer is an issue, and this will affect the production of the coming planting season. So it's also an urgent issue. And of course, affordability of food for poor households. That's why the 4 areas of focus that we hope to coordinate with others are: first, supporting production and producers. This is about removing input trade barriers on fertilizers, increasing production of fertilizers, financing of seeds and fertilizers to farmers and smallholders, more efficient use of fertilizers, so build in longer term issues in there. And this is an issue that we had in 2008. How do we manage diversion of food for biofuel? Second, facilitate increased trade, open trade. This was the joint statement that we made with the WTO and the IMF a couple of weeks ago. We need to build consensus on this. Because the increased export restrictions, we counted 30 countries that are already introducing export restrictions. This is slightly below 36 countries in the 2008 crisis, Pascal. We really need to manage this because it does lead to fluctuations of prices and reducing of the availability. We would like to call on the principles that were agreed on by the G20 to have if you are going to impose restrictions for your own emergency purposes, they should be proportionate, targeted, transparent, and temporary, and not increase trade barriers consistent with WTO and so on. Third, supporting vulnerable households. It should be targeted support for vulnerable households for the affordability, to address the affordability, not price controls or blanket subsidies, which tend to be not leading you to the right supply and demand responses. Finally, short-term, medium-term, you must invest in the sustainable food and nutrition security. Invest in strong agriculture and food systems. So it's not just about the short-term. At the same time, you have to address the drivers of the food insecurity and food sufficiency, food production sufficiency in countries like Africa, in regions like Africa, which is now 80% dependent on food imports. Let me stop there, Pascal.
Thanks very much, Mary, for outlining this big picture, producing, trading, investing, growing. Those are the main pillars which need to be put in place. And thanks for addressing what the World Bank is doing, both short-term and long-term. I'll now give the floor to Chrysola Varpopoulou, whom, as I said, is just inaugurating a new position as a French Development Secretary of State. You have the floor, Chrysola.
Merci beaucoup, Pascal. Good afternoon to everyone. And of course, allow me to thank the organizer of the Paris Peace Forum for convening this discussion on the consequences of the war in Ukraine on global food security. Figures speak for themselves. Russia's aggression of Ukraine is a direct threat not only to the 400 million people which Ukraine is providing food for, but also to global food security in a context where the World Food Programme and FAO estimates that the war could add another 40 million people to the 161 million already affected by food insecurity in 2022. There is an imminent risk of a humanitarian catastrophe. We must stand ready collectively to a long-lasting crisis that calls for further coordination of the United Nations and all the international partners. This situation is further worsened by the effects of climate change globally, and especially droughts. Protectionism cannot be the answer. Protectionism can only worsen the situation by driving commodity prices further and giving way to a crisis of confidence, which we must do everything to avoid. We need to affirm very clearly that there is no place for weak diplomacy and that food security cannot be bargained with for political purposes. In this regard, the Russian Federation cynicism is unacceptable and is harming directly our most vulnerable partners, especially on the African continent. The global community has already taken action to set the multilateral framework we need through the United Nations Global Crisis Response Group, the Global Alliance for Food Security launched by Germany, and the call to action initiated last week in New York. Beyond this essential political and financial mobilization, I think we also need to have a very clear sense of what we want to achieve and in what order. There is the objective of the Food and Agriculture Resilience Mission Farm that was endorsed by the European Council to provide a roadmap of the concrete actions that need to be taken around three fronts. Firstly, trade. We absolutely need to keep global trade for essential agricultural goods open. On this front, we count on the World Trade Organization to keep track of export restrictive measures and to foster discussion in view of the June ministerial meeting. We also need to work collectively on enhancing price and stock transparency. AMIS is a crucial partner in this regard, and that is why France has announced a new financial contribution of 100,000 euros. Secondly, solidarity, because we need to keep supporting our most vulnerable partners through emergency food aid and to ensure that the World Food Programme has the capacity to deliver its operation in a context of soaring prices. We need a solidarity mechanism to address market failure and provide a buffer in case the crisis worsens. We count on the World Food Programme to share a proposal on the very short term. We count also on the private sector to contribute to this global effort. Just to remember to everybody that we need to keep supporting Ukraine's agricultural sector, notably by helping the country export its commodities. That is the sense of the Solidarity Lanes initiative put forward by the EU Commission and providing essential input, fertilizer, fuel, and seeds. And thirdly, production, as Pascal said. Production is the only way to ensure local food sovereignty, especially in countries most exposed to food insecurity. This can only be achieved by developing sustainable food production capacities and food systems globally. On this front, FARM provides area for a strong cooperation with the African Union and our African partners through concrete investment promoted by IFAD's action. Thanks to World Trade Organization, the World Food Programme, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, we have already made strong progress around these three pillars with concrete actionable proposals that I will leave them present and which we should seek to implement very shortly. Thank you very much and good afternoon to everybody.
Thanks, Minister, for this comprehensive description. We've already heard from you and from Mary Pangetsu that trade should remain open. But trade is not remaining open. We've had export restrictions, export bans on palm oil, on wheat, on sunflower seeds and oil. So let's turn now to Jean-Marie Pogam from the WTO. Mr. Pogam, what is the WTO doing? Is it doing something, given these restrictions that appear here and there, apart from advocating? What sort of levers do you have to avoid these food restrictions, export restrictions, contributing to the speculation and to high prices? Over to you, Jean-Marie.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, the WTO is obviously participating to all the initiatives of international cooperation which have been mentioned, including the UN Secretary General Global Crisis Group. We also maintain a close dialogue with the private sector, which is very important to make sure that the food supply chains are working. To concretely address your question, what is it that we are doing? 3 lines of action, which are pretty much aligned with some of what has been already said and some of the inspiration of the farm initiative. The first one is to try to help keep the market transparent. As Mary has been mentioning, food is available for now. Maybe next year it's different, but for now, the question is not so much availability as accessibility. So we are monitoring closely the market measures which are being taken by our members and asking them to notify their measures. This is essential to help prevent the risk of a crisis of confidence or any panic mode reaction with the proliferation of trade measures. At this stage, I would say that the situation is quite tense, but overall remains more or less under control. Our count is that 22 of our members, the EU counting as one, have been taking export restrictive measures, and around 20 of them have been taking import facilitating measures. So it is tense, but it's not a proliferation, and I converge here with Marie, who says that it's not exactly what has been happening in the 2008 crisis. Second line of action is to keep market open. And here there are several initiatives in the wake of our ministerial meeting by mid-June to prepare for declarations, inviting countries to abide by the WTO disciplines on export restrictions in times of crisis and give due consideration to the needs of net food importing countries. And also call for countries to ensure that any emergency trade measures on food and fertilizers would remain temporary, targeted, proportionate, and focused. So this is more or less a replication of what has been tried by the G20 and also the WTO during the pandemic on trade and health. And the good news, without being too optimistic, is that it worked in 2020 because we saw that the trade in health product soared in a context where world trade was collapsing. So we are hoping to reproduce the same. There is a specific initiative that I need to mention, which is about exempting the purchases of the World Food Programme from any export restriction. And I think there is a very strong momentum with our members. It's on the top of their agenda now and could be delivered as a decision at our ministerial meeting by mid-June. Some remain to be convinced. There are 2 of them, but we are hopeful that it will work. Now, the third line of action is obviously for the mid-long term. It's about reducing market distortion. And here we are just continuing with our long-standing effort to reform agricultural policies which have a negative impact on trade. At the heart of the discussion lies the question of the autonomy of countries to adopt measures that they would deem necessary to improve their domestic food security, such as public stockholding programs for food security, but at the same time prevent spillovers or negative spillovers on the trade of other countries and the lives of the consumers and producers of other countries. So these three lines of action, market transparent, market open, and reforming the agricultural policies, are what we are hopeful we can deliver something in 2 or 3 weeks. The negotiations are going on, quite tense, as always happened in the wake of ministerial meeting, but we are positive. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jean-Marie. We'll now turn to the World Food Programme, whose permanent business is to bring food to people and places in need. Is there anything specific to this crisis? Ute Klamert, is it something which you were prepared to handle? Do you have recommendations or questions for your friends on this virtual table to make your work easier rather than more difficult, which, as I understand, unfortunately, it is already? Over to you, Ute.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to first of all to be here with you, and secondly also to listen to the colleagues also World Bank and WTO, and also thank you, Minister, for your really paving the way for my input. I was thinking and changing my input completely because I want to say we have, from a WFP perspective, number one, the figures, Minister, what you mentioned is the figures are super alarming, right? And if the figures are marching up to 300 million, 23, I would say, it's super alarming. So many people in acute hunger. We never had such a figure before. And this is really, really, calling for action. Where is definitely your support needed? We had, as WFP, we had compiled here 3 political asks. The first one is commit to diplomatic efforts for political solutions to the conflict. It is the root cause of hunger that we simply cannot afford. And we all know the UN resolution. We need to prevent hunger from being used as a weapon of war. That's the first request. The second one was mentioned already: ensure humanitarian access to affected populations, including the immediate reopening of the Black Sea ports, so that the critical food from Ukraine can reach the hungry. And the third is ensure sufficient financial support to address the humanitarian needs. Because, as I said, if the numbers of people in acute hunger is going up, we need simply more financial support to address that. In addition, we have 3 asks, Chair, to the international community to maintain a functioning food supply. And I'm so grateful that WTO was really, really supporting what we think is needed. And also our colleague from the World Bank. Ensure that trade is open for food, fuel, pesticides, and fertilizers to contain food security. That's essential. What we need second, avoid export restrictions and import subsidies. And the third one is in particular very important, and also was mentioned by WTO, exempt humanitarian assistance from restrictive trade policies. But I want to conclude that humanitarian aid is only a necessary band-aid, and the war in Ukraine must be a turning point by the way we address global food security. And Chairperson, exactly here, the Farm Initiative is so essential, as well as the Global Action Plan, the IFA Action Plan to address global food security, the G7 initiative, and to connect all the dots and make it work. That's so essential for us. But as I said, and allow me to come back to, in particular, the exemption for humanitarian assistance from restrictive trade policies is so essential because time is working against us, and we have to, in a way, react in a very fast manner. And this is why I allowed myself to really formulate also our political requests. Maybe I stop here because I'm sure there is enough time to go a little bit deeper into the farm initiative and maybe also solidarity pillar, the pillar 2, and what we have planned in concrete terms. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ute, and thanks for keeping your intervention short. We might, of course, go back to that if others do the same as what you've done. And thanks for recalling, which Jean-Marie Pogam already did, that we had attempts in the past within the World Trade Organization to have the members committing to exonerate, to waive the World Food Programme from any export restrictions. So far, we did not get a consensus on this. And I hope that, and including in 2008, where, if I remember well, we tried very hard. So maybe this time it might work. So good luck to Jean-Marie and his colleagues for bringing this, hopefully, to some positive conclusion. I'll now turn to Gabriel Ferrero. You are, Gabriel, in a sort of overarching position. You are in a tower, control tower, in a way, that can link what your various colleagues are doing. How optimistic are you, Gabriel, that this time the system will coordinate, the system will connect? There won't be meetings and meetings and meetings, and then who does what is still unclear. What's your take on this potential of moving rapidly to response and action this time?
Thank you very much indeed, President Lamy, also for providing me the opportunity to speak here today as the chairperson of the Committee on World Food Security of the United Nations, hosted in FAO, which indeed is one of those institutions that the Secretary General referred to on his opening interview as a global public good that lacks of teeth sometimes in an imperfect global governance on some of the core global public goods such as food is. But I need to be optimistic, Mr. Lamy. We are living probably the most difficult times for multilateralism in the last decades and probably since the foundations of the United Nations. But as the Secretary General said before, we are more conscious than ever that we need to make this work, and that all the pieces that are coming together, emerging from the different initiatives, such as the Farm Initiative, such as the Global Call to Action last week, such as the G7 Global Alliance on Food Security, all these initiatives point out at different elements of the solution. There is enough consensus on what needs to be done. And this starts with peace as the most effective and less costly way of facing this crisis. But it goes with the package deal, as the Secretary General also referred to, for bringing out the grains and the inputs out of the area in conflict. And we know that it's about trade, and we know that it is about social protection. We know that it is about boosting production, focusing on those that feed the world on its majority, and that they are able to deliver on more resilient food systems, small-scale producers, family farmers, cooperatives, small and medium enterprises. It's also about humanitarian assistance. So it is about what the Farm Initiative and the other initiatives are pointing out in different ways. Now, what we need, from my perspective, Pascal, is to bring this all together. And this is what the committees such as the Committee on World Food Security is mandated to do. It is the UN intergovernmental platform with beyond 135 member states, but it's also the most inclusive one. It was reformed 12 years ago, precisely to face the global food crisis in those days, in 2008. to bring the voice of civil society, the private sector, and the whole of the United Nations system and international financial institutions together. So concluding, Pascal, this is what I'm committed to do. I will be convening together with the Global Crisis Response Group of the Secretary General in close partnership, a high-level event later in July in the sites of the high-level political forum, precisely also to keep the long-term vision, sustainable development, and the SDGs is our compass and needs to be kept as our compass, but providing this CFS, the Committee on World Food Security platform, for bringing all the initiatives together gently and maybe catalyzing more coordinated globally policy responses. So thank you once again, Pascal, over to you.
Thanks, Gabriel. Let me turn now to the IFAD, which is a bank whose very focus is helping a number of developing countries improving their capacity to produce food. Mr. Zeller, what is the reaction of IFAD to this crisis? Are you in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term? Are you involved in this cooperation around the UN crisis group? What's your take? And I will then move to Africa and then to my good friend Joe Glauber. Mr. Zeller.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. And like Ute did, I just put my notes on the side and try to just speak from my heart. And like Ute did, my first remark must also be, this war has to stop. This aggression has to stop. We all know that most of the poor people worldwide live in conflict-affected countries, in fragile countries, and fragility and conflict is never a setting in which anybody can prosper. And in the globalized times, this crisis doesn't just hit Russia, who is shooting a bit in their own foot, and the Ukraine as victim here. It also hits plenty of other countries around the world. And as it adds to the COVID crisis, we can talk about something like a meltdown of the global food systems that is threatening to happen if we don't react immediately and forcefully. My second remark, I also feel that we see a proliferation of new initiatives now. And I hope that we can manage to coordinate these initiatives. I'm proud of the players around this table that we have together and jointly put together so many initiatives, but none of them should be the initiative to end all other initiatives. We should bring together the advantages and the capabilities of each of the institutions to make the best of what we jointly can put together. I would like to say that, yes, IFAD is very much involved. We are a smaller player than the World Bank, but still over the next 3 years, we can make $3.5 billion available to support people in our recipient countries. We are working in around 80 countries around the world, and we are focusing very much on the poorest people. We reach about 130 million of them per year, and we can see that especially the smallholder farmers are suffering a lot because the supply chains now are interrupted for the second time in just 2 years, first COVID and now this crisis. And I would like to say, yes, we are with the Secretary General in the crisis reaction group, but we are also supporting France and the Farms Initiative, and we are also supporting Germany, the G7, the European Union, and anybody else. We are part of the global alliance that Germany has put together. And I'm proud to say that in particular in the Farms Initiative, where Pillar 3 is dedicated to strengthen local agricultural production in vulnerable countries so that the local producers can provide local food and that there's more resilience in these countries, that they are less dependent on the global supply chains. We want to play a leading role. France has invited us to play that leading role, and we are now consulting lead partners, key partners on Pillar 3, which at the same time are also involved in the other initiatives, how to structure this, because in the end, it's only figures that counts, how we can make money available, additional money. I talked about the 3.5 billion that we will have. We could easily do twice that amount. IFAD has committed to double its impact within the next 7 years. In order to be able to do that, we also need commitments from our traditional sponsors, from the traditional donor countries. So that's what we are hoping for. And we will see to it that we increase local production, as I said, that we encourage the consumption of local production, change a bit the basket of what people are eating, that we develop domestic markets, that we also make microfinance available to the smallholders so that they can scale up, that they can extend the production. There's a lot of arable land, especially in Africa, that is not under production, that is not used. And we need to increase the production per hectare, but we also need the amount of arable land that is really used for the production if we want to reduce the number of people who will fall into absolute poverty and who will suffer from hunger and even die from hunger. And finally, we need to reduce the production losses and the waste around the supply chains, because that's another big topic that we have not really yet managed to tackle very convincingly. So much for the start. Happy to hand back to you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Mr. Zeller, and thanks for, again, focusing your words on what you do, what needs to be done, and how it needs to be done. I'm very grateful that all of you so far have stuck to this party line of mine. Thanks very much. I'll now turn in the same spirit to Dr. Godfrey Baigwa. What is, from the AU, African Union Commission, what is Africa expecting from the response which the dotted lines of which you've seen or heard from previous speakers? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Pascal. The African Union Commission appreciates the opportunity to make remarks during this platform, and thanks the Paris Peace Forum for inviting the African Union to be part of this dialogue. So in terms of trying to respond to the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the African food systems, the AUC chairperson, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, has established an interdepartmental task force that will keep the AU leadership informed of the situation as it emerges, and keeping also our member states abreast of the developments. So to respond, the AU Commission is looking for practical ways to address the impact of this crisis on our economies. And last week on May 19th, the AU chairperson, together with the president of the Africa Development Bank, organized a joint meeting of ministers of agriculture and ministers of finance. That was last week on Thursday, to discuss an initiative by the Africa Development Bank to have an emergent food production plan, focusing specifically on 4 commodities, largely which are imported from into the continent, that is wheat, rice, maize, and soybean. And that initiative, to the tune of about $1.5 billion US, is meant to provide quality seed to farmers, fertilizers, as well as advisor services. So that is an initiative of the Africa Union Commission and the Africa Development Bank to practically respond to the impacts of the crisis in our member states. And so in this particular aspect of boosting food production, we look forward to working with IFAD, the role that has been allocated to them under the France's Farm Initiative, to work together to see how we can jointly boost that effort. The AU leadership is also engaging with international partners to discuss different partnerships on how to respond on the impact of this crisis. We have already had meetings with the French ambassador to Ethiopia and Africa Union on the Food and Agriculture Resilience Mission. 2 meetings actually, and we are waiting to get steps on what exactly the concrete actions will be that will be behind that initiative. Also, last week we had a meeting with the Germans on the Global Alliance on Food Security. Again, we put forward our priorities which are in line with everything that has been talked about here, trade, boosting production, and so on. And with these various initiatives, and again, I want to agree with IFAD on this, that there are now several initiatives and they are targeting, focusing on Africa. We need to have improved coordination among the various initiatives so that we avoid duplication of effort, but also maximize the impact of the limited resources that may be available. So coordination among these initiatives is going to be key. And finally, the AU leadership is calling for increased financing behind these initiatives. I think the action areas are clear, but the resources are limited to respond in a meaningful manner. And so we are calling for increased resource mobilization to put behind these initiatives, but keeping in mind that we would not create a debt crisis on top of the food crisis. So we are mindful of that and aware that our countries are recovering just from the COVID-19, which was heavy fiscally on our economies. And so we don't want this food crisis to also add to the debt concerns that our member states have. With that, I yield back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Godfrey. I will now turn to Joe Glover in 1 second. Remember, you have the possibility to ask questions either on the chat or on YouTube, and I will try to make sure I have another screen where they normally appear, if there are any. So please do that. We still have half an hour ahead of us for this session, and as much as we can take questions from the public and the attendance, I would like. Joe Glover, you are in this panel with 3 hats. The first one is your AMIS hat, the Agricultural Market Information System, which is a result of the 2008 crisis, and I think a very positive one, given the lot of information and transparency you bring to the markets. Second, as an expert at the CGIAR/IFPRI, and you've been on the front line explaining A, what's happening, B, where the vulnerabilities are. We've all seen your IFPRI vulnerability map everywhere in the media, and thanks for that, because I think it's a good way to focus attention. And third, as an old friend, when you were a US ag trade negotiator, but that was in the Middle Ages, in the time where I was a trade negotiator. And I remember full well your formidable capacity to synthesize a lot of very complex data. So, Joe, you've heard our friends saying what they are doing, mentioning that there is some sort of coordination, and I'll come back to that. Where you are as an expert with your formidable radar at AMIS and at IFPRI, what is your most urgent recommendation for policymakers, international institutions? What would you say you have to do tomorrow, which you are not doing enough today?
Yeah, no, thanks, Pascal. And you're absolutely right. AMIS was a direct outgrowth of the price crises in 2008, 7-8, and 2010-11. Without the sort of leadership of France at the time to sort of create this group, we've had since then we've had an active involvement with all the members of AMIS, which include the G20 members and also the large non-G20 importers and exporters. We've just to give you an example, not during 2012-13, we had a large drought. There were a lot of people concerned about markets that we'd see another price crisis. That didn't happen, and I give some credit to AMIS at the time because we spent a lot of time calming markets, and similarly during COVID. This is a different situation, obviously, and it's different. Like a lot of international organizations, Amos too has both Ukraine and Russia as members, and so we've met several times over the last few months since the war started. I think to answer your question, however, in terms of what policies, I would just echo Mari's comments and also Jean-Marie's comments about the markets generally working well, but the problem is, of course, things like trade restrictions. We've seen export restrictions at IFPRI. We track those as well, and as does Amos. And we've talked to our members about that. Hopefully that whatever we see will be temporary in nature. But the other thing I think is all of the distortions that get in the way of markets from functioning better. And I know Jean-Marie has talked about the upcoming ministerial. That will be really important. Hopefully we can make some progress there. But if you look at things like mandates for biofuel production, some of those, suspending those would have immediate impacts. We think, look at vegetable oil market right now, it's at record high levels. And if you look at mandates to have palm oil in biodiesel programs in countries, or in my own country, almost half of our soybean oil that's produced goes into biodiesel production. If it weren't for those mandates, they would go right into a vegetable oil market and help alleviate supply. So there's lots of things I think countries can do without actually trying to intervene in markets, but rather reduce the barriers that are there. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Joe. Now I'm looking at the questions that I see on my other screen. Unsurprisingly, one question is about funding. We know where prices are, 30–40% above normal. We know where the vulnerabilities are, and that's mostly in poor country or heavily import-dependent countries. Is there enough funding? Mary, you need more money to deploy the World Bank arsenal, which is partly new debt, and that's maybe a problem for some countries, partly grants. Does the World Food Programme have enough cash to do what it should do? Mr. Silla, you see the IFAD ready to step in to increase investment? Let's have a short round of answers on this question of funding. Mary?
Yes, it's certainly there's the immediate humanitarian emergency funding, like, with Lebanon, with Cameroon, where we already have deployed emergency support. That it's not alone, it's emergency support, and we're working with World Food Programme. But out of our 30 billion, 8 billion is actually allocated for social protection support in countries, which is a combination of grants, concessional lending, as well as lending, as you said. And this is, I think, where the coordination is very important. We have, requests from countries that are needing the support for the social protection programs. So I would say that partly it's the funding and being able to come together and scale up where it's needed and work together there and be clear what is it that we are funding. And we think it should be really focused and targeted on the most vulnerable portions of the population. And there's a lot of learning going on. Is cash transfers better than food coupons? Is it combining it with school meals, for instance, because that will have the added advantage of getting kids back to school. So we need to also identify what kind of social protection programs are most fit for purpose in that country. And then finally, I think we learned a lot the last 2 years. Basically, we have been humbled by the last 2 years of the pandemic as to how to have effective social protection systems and have better data, have better registration of people that need the help. And it's not just the extreme poor, it's much broader. And it's women. We found that during the pandemic, women were eating less because they were, with your income dropping, you would tend to give food to your family rather than eat yourself. So we need to also think about some of the vulnerabilities and the inclusiveness aspect of the food protection program.
Thanks a lot. Ute, has the World Food Program enough cash?
Unfortunately, my answer is no, but I want to be optimistic and also thankful what we get so far. Our funding forecast is more or less around about 10 billion, and our needs are double as high, around about 20 billion. But the question is, if you have such a situation, how are you investing best the funds you get? And Mari, you said that first and foremost, our priority is definitely, trying to really feed the one who are marching towards that kind of absolute kind of starvation, the category IPC 5, right? But on the other hand, what we know is if we invest in resilience, and if we invest in particular in social protection, the return of investment is 1 to 5 or even 1 to 16. These are the kind of research carried out by the World Bank, carried out by USAID. We know all of that. And this is why I'm so grateful that the IFI action plan to address the global food security is really making an effort, helping us to address, let me say, this kind of short-term aspects of the crisis. And this is absolutely essential. And I was just with the German minister in Lebanon. Exactly the situation, the Syrian refugee response, was a kind of, the learning curve, I have to say, to build up a social protection network, right? And a social protection system. But now we are signing, we've signed a contract with the World Bank, simply supporting the Lebanese households, because all of a sudden 700,000 people in Lebanon, are on our payroll, in converted commas. So, just to combine and do everything in a simultaneous way, humanitarian emergency combining with strong social protection systems and this kind of adaptation, per country, and having that kind of flexible response, that's great. And it seems, going through this IFI action plan, I have to say, we are sitting down because, Chair, you asked me, are we prepared? We are sitting down as WFP and trying to really identify for us a fast track approach, how we can make proposals to the international financing institutions, really to speed up our implementation and find good solutions. And please allow me a third element. I want to raise an issue around our climate adaptation approach. And I think the question how we integrate climate response and build climate resilience into our social protection is so essential. It is so essential that we are not starting compromising, as we speak already on the climate agenda. We have to, in a way, hold the line and try to really, really meet our objectives. And I'm also so grateful that a lot, also the farm initiative is in a way suggesting a lot of that. Let me stop here, but we are really trying to make the best out of the kind of contributions allocated, but certainly to answer your question again, it's certainly not enough. And this is why it's on our political ask. Please, from a donor perspective, please make sure that we at least can address the humanitarian needs.
Thanks a lot. Short word by Mr. Ziller on this finance question, and then I will pick 3 questions on the screen that have appeared and ask you in a final round to answer them. Whatever part of the 3 questions you want. If you can take the 3 questions because I think they're all important. And you just mentioned one, Ute, that will be great. But let's hear first 1 minute of answer from Mr. Ziller, and then I will go to the 3 questions for our final round. Mr. Ziller.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. And I must admit, I'm in the same situation as Ute Klamert is. Yes, we need more money. You mentioned when you gave me the floor for the first time that IFAD is something like a bank. And yes, we are something like a bank. And if you compare us to the World Bank, we obviously are smaller, but we are like a mix of IBRD and IDA. In other words, we give loans, highly concessional and a bit less concessional, depending on the level of development of our recipient countries. But we also have to provide more and more grants because there are more and more heavily indebted poor countries. And there are more and more countries who can't afford loans. And if you look at that, it goes without saying that in order to be stable in what we can do in our 3-year replenishment cycles, we need more replenishment funding to acquire the same level, to achieve the same level of annual disbursements. And this in times where development cooperation budgets become rather tighter, because countries have spent so much money on buffering the effects of COVID, because now countries are driving up their defense budgets, and sometimes to the detriment of the development cooperation budgets. So it becomes more and more difficult for us. We have already almost fully leveraged our balance sheet. We still have a AA+ rating, but if we go further, we'll lose that rating, and our whole business case for going for the capital market and providing loans from that will not be viable any longer. So in other words, for us, if we're really meant to do more, yes, we definitely need more money. That is why we also put up a facility, the Crisis Response Initiative, not because we feel we need to proliferate and multiply additional vehicles, additional special purpose vehicles, but we have donor countries who have earmarked funding, which cannot go to our core, which cannot go to our replenishments, but which can go in such a targeted vehicle. And therefore, this is what we have put together for countries who want to specifically foster IFAD's program in reaction to this Russia-Ukraine war. And so far, we have already a few countries who have contributed and a few others in the pipeline. So it seems that this will at least be proverbial in German, there's a German proverb, a drop of cold water on a hot stone. At least that it is. And if there's more to come, we'd be very happy. Back to you, Chair. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. So here are the 3 questions I select for this final round. We have 15 minutes left, which means that you have 2 minutes each, either for 3 questions or for one of the 3 questions. First, and this was already mentioned by Ute a moment ago, can we both address this incredible urgency and keep our climate objectives, as a number of them imply changes in the farm production and consumption system? So in other words, is there this tension? How to handle it? Second question, we have here representatives of international organizations, public organizations. What about the private sector? What about philanthropy? Does the private sector and philanthropy have a role to play in addressing this question? And the third one, which is a bit more tricky, but which fits with a question I've had for some time. If the name of the game is a sort of, we have to cope with this situation, whatever it takes, as we did it for the banks at some time, or for the economy during crisis, do we have a sort of Wir schaffen das spirit that addresses the question? If yes, where is the roadmap? Where is the short operational roadmap of what to do, who does what, in order for markets to get the message that there will be enough food at the right place at the right time, thus depressing this speculative bubble we are in, and which for many people is the real problem. So these are the three questions that appear. Of course, the third one is pretty operational, but I take it that those who have attended this conversation feel they know roughly what each of you is doing, but they'd like to know more what the club of you is doing in order to impress the situation. I'll take, you take the order, the same one as the one, Mary first.
So on your three questions, I do believe you can address both the urgency of the food insecurity and climate. You just have to do it in an integrated way. For instance, when we are providing fertilizer support for farmers, we can also at the same time introduce more efficient use of fertilizer and more sustainable agriculture practices. And then in the longer investments in the agriculture and food systems, most definitely you need to build in the climate agenda, whether it's the water issue or the land issue and so on. So I do believe it's actually an opportunity for that. Second, most definitely private sector needs and philanthropy can play a big role. And in fact, in the spring meeting, when we had the food security session, we had philanthropies and private sector in attendance, and they all asked, okay, what can we do? And that's why it's very important for us to agree on, what do we need to do together, and have it very clearly outlined with very specific actions. And even in specific countries, this is what we plan to do so that they can come in to do that. And we have our private sector arm, the IFC. They are providing support for fertilizer production, as well as, the agriculture value chain, and financing for agriculture and trade financing as well. On your very last question, this is really about transparency of information on stocks, even though we know that you can only get information on stocks if there are buffer stocks in the country. You can't get information on stocks which are not in public hands. The information on prices becomes very important. So I think what we can do with AMIS is very important, and whether we can strengthen, improve. I think that's one of the farm ideas, is to improve this dashboard on stocks of production. It's very hard to estimate production and stocks, but prices, to me as a former trade minister, is actually the most accurate predictor. Thanks, yeah. So I think that's what I would like to say.
Very good. We now have 2 minutes each. Jean-Marie.
Thanks, Chair. I'll try to pick up your question on urgency and private sector together. And although it's beyond the WTO, basically the first emergency is to try to take out the grain from both Russia and Ukraine, which is available, and flow it to the world market. And this should be in theory possible because these agricultural food products or fertilizer are not under sanctions and can be exported. But the private sector tells us that it does not happen, and it does not happen for 3 reasons. The first one is security. We have this discussion on food corridors, which have been started at the Maritime International Organization, which is very important. If security of the corridor can be ensured, then the insurance prices for the boats will go down, and that's a second obstacle. And then the third element is over-compliance from trade finance banks, which do not go on the market at this time. So we have now, I do not have the figures for Russia, but I have them for Ukraine. We have 25 million tons of grains now in the silos. We have 33 million coming from the winter crop. So that makes 50 million, which have to be taken out. Normally, Ukraine exports 5 to 6 million by month. Now it's around 20%. So the first answer, and I'm trying to get out of my WTO box here and address your point about what collectively we can do, is to enable the private sector to get that grain out in the very short term. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Jean-Marie. That's very clear. And thanks for introducing this sort of food corridor notion, this trade finance dimension, which wasn't mentioned so far. And I just recall that the fertilizer issue is also a big part of that, not least because this is the area where there is a problem of supply and demand, which you do not have on sort of farm gate goods. Ute, and then Gabrielle, and then Dominique.
I'm super brief to make your life easier, Chair. Number one, private sector, no doubt, we need the private sector. Philanthropy, we have to be very clear, philanthropy is just funding and supporting midterm and long-term solutions, not getting into the humanitarian domain. And for the philanthropy, what is in our mind, asking them in particular for digital solutions. That's number one. Number two, climate. We see, we are optimistic and hopeful that we see that rather as a chance to integrate than to compromise on the climate agenda. Talking about encouragement of local and regional production, encouragement of regional trade, get into this biofertilizer, diversify the seeds, and the crops. And all of that, and really listening to our colleagues from the African Union and our African countries. What is, what do the customers want, and come up with a kind of climate adaptive solution. Number three is all about what we want to also tackle in our solidarity pillar. And Marie, you touched upon that. Evidence generation and matching demand and supply dashboard, really getting into that kind of, the information, and really trying also, in very practical terms to create a difference and fast track. Again, time is working against us.
Thanks very much. Mr. Ferrero, your 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be fast. 3 yes to your 3 questions. And I'll explain. First, indeed, it can be integrated. Actually, it's one of the keys for overcoming this crisis, integrating the climate, biodiversity, soils, solutions that also deliver at the short term on what is happening. And this is part of the transition to sustainable food systems that needs to be even more now than it was 6 months ago when we discussed this at the summit. 4 very quick points. The first one, on the public side, we need to do quickly and effectively all our best to channel investments to those that integrate these kind of solutions on the short term and the long term, on resilience and on sustainability. And this means to smallholders and family farmers, linked to social protection mechanisms. And we have some already existing tools, such as the GAFSP, the Global Agricultural and Food Security Program that the World Bank mentioned, that are ready, that are established for 10 years now, a good network of working together, the UN system with local governments, supporting country-led solutions. The second is we need indeed to take this opportunity to make the investments that will be attracted by higher prices from the private sector to function on delivering also for the 3 dimensions of sustainable development or for the SDGs. And this means that the private investors that will be attracted, we need to work much better with the private sector so that these investments are not going to practices that are not desirable, such as land grabbing, and that goes through public-private partnerships to deliver also in support of smallholder farmers, etc. And third, speaking to whatever it takes, I believe that yes, but this speaks to the need of mobilizing the financial bazookas and not the weapons, by the way. And this speaks to the IMF, to the special drawing rights, and the World Bank, which is the big ones that can really support the public, the fiscal space. Sorry that it's needed. And the postscript, I finish with this, Pascal. Would be terrible news if ODA comes down at this point. For WFP, but for the whole international community, terrible news. And I stop it here. I'm speaking also as a Spanish ambassador. It's not a UN official. I'm a Spanish ambassador at large, and I'm very clear on that. I'm a donor country. Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you very much, and thanks for mentioning this SDR issue, which is, as it was during COVID, looming over this issue. Mr. Ziller, then Dr. Willinger, and then Joe.
Yeah, many thanks, Chair. On these SDRs, I feel provoked now to pour a bit of water into the wine, because I feel we have plenty of needs where we need grants. And to turn these SDRs into grants is almost impossible. And if we don't manage to do that, we will not be able to address the deteriorating situation in some countries. So I'm a bit skeptical. Well, it doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate it, but it's not the wonder weapon, be it bazooka or whatever, that people would need in this situation. I think we have indeed a spirit of wir schaffen das, whatever it takes. Just this morning, we had another meeting at deputy level of the Rome-based agencies to better harmonize what we're doing. We have at the UN level the crisis response group of the Secretary General, and I can see that also all the countries who are leading multilateral initiatives, multilateral fora at this time are really very proactive. So as I said before, I'm very proud of this. On the other hand, there's also some strange behavior. On one hand, by some countries, we talked earlier about trade restrictions for at least 10% of the globally usually exported calories. It's a bit like the toilet paper phenomenon that we had in Germany under COVID, where everybody feared that there might be a scarcity of toilet paper and everybody went and bought it. And in the end, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. This should not happen here. Many countries who put export bans don't need to put those because there's really no risk that their population will starve. So they should stop this. And then if you talk about the private sector, well, usually you think about the philanthropists, about socially inclined investors. I would also like to admonish the private sector not to be, if I may use another German phrase, Kriegsgewinnler, somebody who benefits from the war. Even if there's a scarcity, you should not multiply your benefits by just increasing the prices because there's a felt scarcity. That is even worse than the real scarcity. So that is something where I would like to appeal to the private sector to keep prices reasonable. I'm not a believer in governmental lids on prices, but we need to do something to avoid this. Many thanks, and back to you.
Thanks a lot. Mr. Baigwa and Joe, you have to share the remaining 2 minutes. My conclusion will only take 15 seconds. Mr. Baigwa.
Yes, I will be brief, and I'll comment on production versus climate change and a little bit on the private sector. So on production, and I go back to the points made earlier by IFAD, for Africa to increase food production and be self-sufficient or have food sovereignty on the continent, we have to do two things. One is intensifying food production, especially in land-scarce countries, so improved seed, fertilizer application, and so on. And then extensifying food production in land surplus countries. 60% of arable land in the world is resident in Africa. We have to bring more land into production without compromising necessarily climate change. But at the same time, we don't want to feel too guilty on climate change because Africa is the least contributor to climate change in this world. So we want to increase food production responsibly, but definitely bring more land into production and also increase unit of land productivity in the land shortage countries. On the private sector, first of all, the largest producers of food in Africa are the small scale farmers, and they are the private sector. So maybe we have different perspectives on what we are talking about here by the private sector. If you are talking about the large agribusiness companies, we are in touch with the private companies, especially the fertilizer producing companies on the continent, because we need to work with them to increase fertilizer production given the shortages created by the conflict.
Okay.
And with the plan that we have with the Africa Development Bank, that is one of our key target areas to work with the private sector to boost fertilizer production.
Thanks very much. Joe, 30 seconds.
Okay. First, the simple one is do no harm, and let's not take on policies that are just going to exacerbate these problems. And I think that's good advice for all countries and international organizations. And let's really put efforts in helping the needy. And I think that's meaning do that in the most efficient way. And so don't put all these restrictions on humanitarian aid and other things. Let's get it to those who know how to use it and how to get it to those who are in need most. And I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot. 2 words of conclusion, which I take from the reactions we got from the one who attended this very rich session. Number 1, we need a whatever it takes food action plan for the G7 and for the G20. So please try together to table something which a large audience of people on this planet will understand, which is the food, whatever it takes, in order for markets to get a signal that these price hikes are speculative, and if they go on in this direction, at some stage they are going to lose money. So we need a credible action plan. Remember, the whatever it takes was not just words, it was immediately after action that made this credible. And finally, I take from the audience the appreciation of what one of you said, which will be my final point. Food should not and is not a weapon. Thanks very much for your participations. Thanks to the many who have attended this session, and I could see in reaction that it's an incredibly emotional topic, rightly so, given the number of people on this planet who now are in the danger of hunger. Being back to hunger is one of the terrible things which humanity has always tried to avoid. Let's try and keep it this way for the times to come. Thanks for your participation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Pascal.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone.
Yes, thank you to
Thank
everyone.
you. Yeah.
Great session.
Thank you all. Thank you.